the 12 British Storm Shadows missiles fired into Russia, quite deep into Russia apparently. A Mail saying that Keir Starmer personally approved the missile strike because they are, it was ordered by America, but they are British-made weapons, right? I was just wondering, and I know there are obviously national security issues at heart of this, but you know, is there not a requirement for people, if there is to be military action taken wherever it is, that you have to present it to Parliament first?
There is no actual requirement for it to happen, but if you go back to the 2013 decision where Parliament actually voted against military action in Syria, where Bashar al-Assad was using chemical weapons against his own people, it was viewed that there should be a precedent when you're looking at significant military action that the MP should be given a vote on as to whether it should take place or not, especially when it's controversial. And I think the argument, there'll be a twofold argument from Keir Starmer and his team in Number 10. And the first is that this isn't, you know, Britain at war or Britain actually deploying those weapons. But actually, if you think back to only in January when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, Keir Starmer was saying, hang on a moment, Rishi Sunak needs to come to Parliament and explain exactly why he was...
why am I not surprised? What, you mean some hypocrisy possibly here?
He did say, you know, we need to have a say, it needs to be explained to us in Parliament as to why he's decided to launch military action in the Middle East against the Houthis in order to safeguard those trade routes through that, of course, the Houthis were disrupting. Exactly. And he was saying, actually, Sunak needed to be making that statement. And he now is, you know, he's in Rio de Janeiro. This is obviously, this has been authorised. It's taken his personal authorisation to, OK, the Americans, you know, they led the charge, if you like, with that decision around their own long-range missiles. But given where Putin was at, given the statements that were coming out of Russia over the last few days since that original American decision, you would think that actually Starmer would have the courtesy to come before MPs and say, we need to speak about this.
Because rather, you know, like the Iraq war situation, I mean, there were plenty of conversations that went on in Parliament before any action was taken, and it wasn't considered a national security breach or a risk or anything, because you could still have the conversation in principle, you know, would we be willing to supply... Because we had this yesterday with Peter Kyle, because we saw that Joe Biden yesterday authorised the use of landmines, basically, despite the fact there's a UN convention which Britain has signed up to, which says that we think they're illegal. And it was explained to me by one of our military guys, well, the Americans don't recognise that, and neither does Ukraine. So even though Britain does, and I had Peter Kyle on, and I said, well, how do you feel about this? And he said, well, it's not for us to say. Well, it kind of is, really. I mean, you know, so you talk about friendly allies in China, you know, a critical friend. I said, why don't you be a critical friend to America and say, well, actually, we've signed up to the convention which says that these are ghastly, horrible implements of torture and medieval death, and yet you're OK with them implementing them.
And you can't, and as we've seen in Africa, you know, once they're deployed, you can't get rid of them.
No.
OK, there's a war today between Ukraine and Russia, but actually, when you've got these landmines, you know, in 5-10 years' time, people will be trying to return home potentially, and there'll be these fields just covered in landmines, and then you end up with people left with amputations because they're children who've walked across these landmines.
Exactly. And funny enough, it was Tony Blair who signed up to the UN declaration.
And you wonder why, you know, politicians, they sit there and they don't say, you know, you asked Peter Carr a straightforward question, denounce this, and he hasn't done so. And you wonder why. So
would you expect to see Keir Starmer in Parliament today explaining this?
No. I don't think he'll be in Parliament today. I think he's going to be... And I think this is a problem, Mike. I think he needs to, you know, rather than being dragged back and MPs potentially having to table urgent questions. And by the way, he hasn't even publicly said whether he, you know, Number 10, nobody within the government has said...
There's been no official
comment. It's only been confirmed unofficially by sources that these were... And originally it came out because there were bloggers in Russia who were looking at bits of shrapnel off these missiles and seeing the word Storm Shadow, that it came to light. And then sources have confirmed that up to 12 of the missiles have been used in Russian territory in Kursk to target underground command posts. But actually, you know, it should be a question of... If you're going to say on national security grounds, MPs can't be given a say beforehand, you would expect the Prime Minister to be here in London, in Westminster, updating MPs and giving them a say, because the implications of this going wrong are very, you know, the risks are very, very high. We saw the Kremlin yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, downgrade the level at which Putin needs in order to launch a nuclear attack. So you know, the
and despite the fact that lots of pundits keep appearing on shows like this saying, oh, you know, Putin's always making these threats, don't worry, it's not going to happen. Well, that's all very well for them to say. Until it does happen. You know what I mean? Exactly right. Let's have a look at what Starmer has said on Ukraine.
There's irresponsible rhetoric coming from Russia, and that is not going to deter our support for Ukraine. We're now on day 1,000 of that conflict. That's 1,000 days of Russian aggression, 1,000 days of sacrifice in Ukraine. We have stood with Ukraine from the start, and I've been doubling down in my clear message that we need to ensure that Ukraine has what is needed for as long as is needed to win this war against Putin.
It seems rather ridiculous to sort of criticise Russia for irresponsible rhetoric, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Considering that they're threatening nuclear war. I mean, it's not really irresponsible rhetoric, is it? I mean, it's a bit more than that. We'll come back to that, of course, and we'll bring you updates as they come in today.